Okay, so here we are on lecture 16. This lecture is really about gas exchange and transport, and I'm going to break these videos up into a few different ones. The first one here is going to be about the control of breathing. So I'd suggest you have your lecture 16 notes, breathing control, gas exchange, and transport. And we're just going to look at the first section here. The other part of the lecture is B and C. Look at basically CO2 and oxygen transport. And so there's three kind of different ideas happening here. Control of breathing first, oxygen transport, then CO2 transport. So let's first think about the control of breathing. So you all know, I know, that when we hold our breath, we can't do it for very long, right? We're forced to breathe. Our body kind of takes over. We have the voluntary ability to choose to breathe, which is a great thing. But then also, if we don't choose to breathe, our body says, no, 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 wait a minute, we're going to go ahead and force you to breathe. And so I want to look at how our bodies know that we need to breathe and how exactly it is that our bodies force us to breathe. So let's take a look at that now. So first though, we have some muscles that are involved, right? So we don't need to know all the muscles in this course. I've labeled a few here. We have external intercostal, so intercostal meaning between the ribs. We have the diaphragm, which we talked about before. As the diaphragm contracts, the size of the thoracic cavity increases and you can inflate your lungs. We have internal intercostals, sort of internal parts, so they're underneath the external intercostals. And then we have oblique muscles, and we can even use our abdominal muscles for breathing. If you want, you can take a minute now and you can stop the video and you can feel some of your muscles when you breathe in and out. So for example, if you push out really hard, you actually do engage your abdominal muscles, right? Um, so and if you're having a viral infection, don't do that too much. But anyway, you can engage all of these muscles. So we use our muscles to breathe. And so if we use our muscles to breathe, there must be kind of neurons innervating those muscles. There are two types of neurons that I'm showing you in this diagram. There's neurons which we call upper motor neurons. Upper motor refers to in the brain. Lower motor neurons refer to neurons in the spinal cord that connect to those muscles that do the work. So these are kind of like the workhorses, whereas the upper motor neurons are the deciders or the decision makers. So if you sort of think of like this COVID virus, right? We have the people on the top, the CDC saying, do this work, make sure you close this or that school. And then at the lower side of things, we have principals, we have presidents of universities, doing the actual closing, shutting the place down, putting the emails out, And so the same sort of thing happens here. We've got these lower motor neurons that talk to our breathing muscles, but then we have upper motor neurons above those that make the decisions, okay? So we have then two types of breathing. We have voluntary breathing, which is shown on the left here, and then we have involuntary breathing. Involuntary breathing comes from the medulla oblongata. So there are neuronal pathways that excite lower motor neurons. So there are upper motor neuron pathways that excite lower motor neurons to tell them to do the work of breathe. The voluntary breathing comes when the upper motor neurons from our decision parts of our brain, the cerebral cortex, talk to those same lower motor neurons and tell them to breathe. So this is a cool kind of thing, right? Because you can make choices to breathe by forcing those lower motor neurons to do their work. You could also, if you choose not to use those muscles, your body will say, no, 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 we're going to force you to breathe. And that comes from the cues from the medulla oblongata, which is not a conscious center of the brain. So that's the basic concept. You have voluntary and involuntary aspects. The next kind of piece here is that the medulla oblongata is itself triggered to cause those downstream triggers to the lower motor neurons because of information that it receives from cells called chemoreceptors. And there are two types of chemoreceptors, which we'll get into. There are chemoreceptors that are in the periphery, so they're not in the central nervous system. Those are called peripheral chemoreceptors, which are found in aortic and carotid bodies. And then there are central chemoreceptors, so these are the ones that are found in the brain, and these are found in the medulla oblongata. So the basic concept here is that if you hold your breath, your blood gases change. And as your blood gases change, those chemoreceptors detect that change, communicate it to the medulla, and then the medulla forces your lower motor neurons in your spinal cord to actually start to fire. And then those muscles we just briefly looked at will start to do their important work of contracting to cause the breathing to happen. Okay, so let's look a little bit more closely at these chemoreceptors. So we're still in part A at the very top here. So there are various cells in the body that are called chemoreceptors, and I think this is point 4 in your notes, that detect various types of stimuli in the blood, the cerebral spinal fluid, or the interstitial fluid of the brain. So what are they detecting? They're detecting gases associated with oxygen or chemicals associated with oxygen. So if you use a lot of oxygen, you produce a lot of CO2. So you can detect increases in CO2 or increases in partial pressure using these chemoreceptors. You can identify decreases in O2 by using these chemoreceptors, and you can also detect decreases in pH. pH decreases when carbon dioxide levels increase. And so if you increase CO2 levels, you decrease pH, and that can be detected too. So these chemoreceptors then are basically like little quality control centers that are constantly monitoring tissue fluids throughout the body and telling the medulla oblongata what the needs are of the body from a breathing perspective. As I mentioned, we think of these as being found either peripherally or centrally. Peripherally or centrally refers to their position with respect to the central nervous system. So a peripheral chemoreceptor is found outside the central nervous system, whereas a central chemoreceptor is found within the central nervous system. It's not so much important that you understand that these are derived from neuroectoderm, but those of you who took biology, developmental biology with me might appreciate this. When something's derived from the neuroectoderm, it means it's very neuron-like. And so what we'll see is that these chemoreceptors are really like excitable cells. So they're very much like muscle or neurons. They can they can undergo electrical changes inside them and like release neurotransmitters, for example. Okay, so let's look at first here the peripheral chemoreceptors. I'm sort of a little mixed up in the notes here. So let's look at the peripheral chemoreceptors. So peripheral chemoreceptors, examples of these are the aortic and carotid bodies. Hopefully you remember that the aortic bodies and the carotid bodies also have baroreceptor cells in them. So these areas can detect changes in blood pressure. They're also used to detect changes in blood gases. And so the aortic bodies, basically there are little cells in here that can detect, for example, a decrease in O2 and communicate that to the medulla. So this is a visual representation of the anatomy that's shown here. Aortic and carotid bodies connecting to the medulla. Aortic bodies connect to the medulla via cranial nerve 10. Carotid bodies connect to the medulla via cranial nerve 9. Both of these feed into the so-called rhythmicity center, and so those can increase the depth, the rate of breathing. As I mentioned previously, these cells that are found in the aortic and carotid bodies are very neuron-like. So what we're looking at here is an example of an oxygen-detecting cell called a glomus cell in the carotid body. This cell would be encountering a lot of blood vessels. When the blood vessels have a low PCO2, that triggers a decrease in the permeability of the cell to potassium. In other words, the potassium channels close. Remember, potassium is always trying to get out of the cell, and so if it's not able to get out of the cell, the potassium levels will build up in the cell, making the cell more and more positive, forcing the cell to get to threshold. And the cell will depolarize as a result, and this will open up a voltage-gated calcium channel as the cell depolarizes or the voltage changes. And so calcium can flood in, then triggering the release of dopamine, which can trigger another neuron to increase the activity of the medulla. So this is again showing a little bit more physiology related to the effects here that then you can connect to why the medulla starts to kind of signal a little bit more quickly. So what are the effects of these little areas, of these peripheral and central chemoreceptors. Well, both of these receptors, as I mentioned, are responsible for detecting changes in oxygen requirements. Even though oxygen can be detected, and I just used that example, it actually turns out that the best way to identify the body's needs from a breathing standpoint are to actually monitor pH and CO2. And we can actually also recognize from our studies before looking at CO2 that CO2 and pH are related, right? So as you increase CO2, you increase the amount of hydrogen ions and you therefore decrease pH. So you have then in the body the ability to detect low O2, also increased CO2, and also increased H+. And all of those things are kind of related to each other. So let's take a look at one of these examples of a peripheral chemoreceptor a central chemoreceptor. So here's a look at a central chemoreceptor. So we looked a little minute ago at a peripheral chemoreceptor here. Now let's consider a central one. So in this central chemoreceptor, we're actually detecting H+. So remember, you wouldn't know this, H+ cannot cross the blood-brain barrier easily. And so what happens instead is that there's a requirement for CO2 to move across the blood vessels of the brain. It can move across easily because it's small and nonpolar. When it's there, it'll react with water to produce H+, and then that H+ can be detected by central chemoreceptors within the brain. And then that's within the medulla oblongata, and that can increase rhythmicity. So here's a couple more details. Peripheral receptors are actually faster than central receptors. The reason is that the reactions are less. This is a very fast kind of process here of neuronal signaling, whereas this takes more time. This is a set of chemical reactions that are time dependent. So peripheral receptors are faster than chemoreceptors, but central chemoreceptors actually account for most of the changes in ventilation. So let's just take a quick look at this diagram. I'd suggest you pause the video and review this diagram on your own so you can see how the respiratory muscles are triggered by decreases in blood pH or increases in plasma CO2. Okay, so you can see here that, for example, blood pH as it decreases can trigger these peripheral chemoreceptors to speak to the medulla oblongata. Also, a decrease in pH can be generated by CO2 passing across the blood-brain barrier to trigger medulla oblongata neurons to increase the activity of the respiratory center and the respiratory muscles. One thing that's not shown in this diagram is that there's also a role for oxygen. It turns out that oxygen is a little less important in its immediate detection and role with respect to rhythmicity in the medulla, but it's also there. This diagram is focusing on those other two. Okay, if you want, you can now take a look at this diagram. This diagram is showing the doubling of the total minute volume as a result of a decrease in pCO2. So pause the video for a second and take a look at this diagram, looking particularly at the effect on CO2 of increasing the total minute volume, or the amount of breath in each tidal volume multiplied by the number of breaths in a minute. If you breathe more, what happens to your CO2 levels? Maybe pause the video and think a little bit about that. Okay, so as you increase your rate of respiration, you'll decrease your CO2 levels, and that's exactly what you want to do, right? You want to decrease CO2 in response to an increase in breathing. So I'm going to stop the video there, and now we're going to move on to oxygen transport in the next video. In that next video, I'll talk a little bit about why oxygen's not used particularly to detect the body's needs from an oxygen level. And the basic reason is that oxygen is actually not mostly dissolved in plasma. And so because it's not dissolved in plasma, it's not really accessible to any of these chemoreceptor cells to be detected. CO2 and H+ are kind of floating around in plasma, and they can be sampled. O2 is actually found inside hemoglobin, or bound to hemoglobin inside red blood cells, and so it's not able to be kind of detected as easily. It is detected eventually when the levels get very, very low, but at the outset it's really not.